Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our second to last Varsity Masterclass. Today we're here at the University of Greenwich. Say hi, everybody. So yeah, like I said, it's our second to last class, which means we only have one left tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to be back at UCL, and I'll be talking there about communities. So I would love for you guys to join us there. And then after the last lecture tomorrow, we're also going to have a little bit of a social where students can meet each other, and then they're also going to be meeting some of the speakers in person. We're going to have some beers and some snacks, that kind of thing. And that'll be at Gordon House at UCL tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. So come along for that. So far we've heard about creative engineering as well as game design, designing for competition, and high-performance teams. If you've missed any of those past lectures, you can find those on our Twitch page, and we'll also be re-airing some of those lectures with a live Q&A session as well. So if you've missed any of them, you'll still get a chance to see them and chat to somebody about your questions. And they'll also be up on our blog later on this week or early next week, along with the slide presentations. So today you're going to be hearing from Adam and Lissa, who are going to chat to you about UI and UX. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the session, as always, both for you guys here in Greenwich and also for everybody watching on Twitch. So if you have questions throughout the stream, you can just throw them into chat, and the mods will be there to record them, and then we'll bring them back out during the Q&A session. That's it for me for now. So I'd like to welcome Adam up first. He's going to kick things off, and yeah, enjoy the session. We'll see you guys soon.
Thank you very much. Hi, nice to meet you all. My name's Adam, and I'm from Space Ape. Some quick introductions. So Space Ape was founded in 2012. There were 12 people. And in 2013, we released our first successful game, Samurai Siege. It was a build and battle game in the style of Backyard Monsters or Clash of Clans. And then we followed that up in 2015 with Rival Kingdoms, which brought Ancients to the build and battle mix. And in 2016, we introduced Transformers Earth Wars, which pitted the Autobots and Decepticons against each other. In 2017, we released Fastlane, which was a bit of a change from our usual build and battle games. It was an action shooter. And also in 2017, we entered into a strategic partnership with Supercell, one of the biggest and best game developers in the world. So now here we are, 100 people, 35 million downloads, lots and lots of new projects in the mix, and it's a really good time to be a Space Ape. So a little bit about myself. I studied graphic design at university. I then went on to work in advertising for a little while. My heart wasn't really in it, so I joined PlayStation, where I worked on a bunch of social titles for them. And then I moved to EA, where I was responsible for bringing a bunch of their titles to social and mobile. And in 2012, I was part of the founding team at Space Ape. So this is what we're going to talk about today. What is video game UX? The intersection between game design and UX design. Lissa's going to talk you through a little UI crash course, and then crafting a compelling experience, and then I'll be back to tell you a little bit about our day-to-day. So when most people think of UI UX, they tend to think of us as the button people. And to a degree, you're kind of right. But it's a little bit more than just putting buttons in the right place and making sure they're the right colour. And we hope over the next half an hour or so, we'll show you all about that. So, a brief history of video game UX. In the beginning, our games were really simple. A joystick, maybe 2 buttons, maybe 1. I believe the instructions for Space Invaders were insert coin and shoot for high score. It doesn't get much more simple than that. Over the next sort of 20 years, our games got more and more complex. UI designers weren't really a thing until much later in the industry, and so these kind of jobs tended to fall to anyone who wanted to do them. What we've seen in the last sort of 10 years is the rise of social and mobile, and bringing in a whole new audience, an audience that aren't used to the conventions of video games, and the free-to-play model, which places an emphasis on keeping people retained and playing your game over a long period of time. And now what we're seeing, especially more in PC and in console, is we're seeing UX and UI being used as a differentiator. People like Riot, Epic, making real big efforts to differentiate their games through these. So when people ask me what UX for games is, I like to tell them it's tools for storytelling. So video games are essentially about stories, but increasingly it's less and less about the stories that we give you as developers and more about the kind of stories that you create with your friends or with your social groups. So whether it's a fire team in Destiny, or the time you took your local team to the championship in Premiership Manager, these are all the kind of stories that you tell your friends about. And these are the kind of stories that I think that UX enables. So UX is the tool that allows you to sign that player in Championship Manager that goes on to win you the European Cup. Or it's the UI that gets you and your friends together for that firefight in Destiny. It's the stuff that holds the gameplay, the artwork, and everything all together. But while we all the time trying to remain fairly invisible. If you're a UI designer, at least in my opinion, if no one mentions your UI in a review, you've done your job really well. So, video game design and UX design, what's the difference? Many people say video game designers are designing an experience, so therefore they are UX designers. And that's kind of true. But I think there is a small difference. Game design is about supplying problems for your players to solve, whereas UX design is about choosing which problems the players should solve. Let's give you an example. This is Need for Speed Payback by EA. The player here has got a whole bunch of problems they're trying to solve. They need to know which direction they need to move in. They're looking at traffic. They're looking at trying to take that corner, the motor skills involved there, as well as worrying about where their opponents are. And what they've done here is a UX decision. They've added these giant blue arrows to try and guide you which way to go. They're removing that problem and putting an emphasis on those other ones. In contrast, something like Burnout Remastered, which just came out this week, simply puts a marker in the world somewhere. This means the city is much more of a character, and much more part of the experience. And learning the roads and learning the traffic and all that kind of stuff is much more integral part of their experience. UX design can also be used to enhance the larger game design, choosing which problems the player solves and defining the experience. So you can't really do a UI talk without mentioning Dead Space. It always comes up in every single one I've ever seen. And apart from looking really great, I think the thing that makes this UI really interesting is it's done in real time. So you're having to manage your inventory whilst being attacked, or trying to find somewhere where you could be safe where you're not being attacked, and completely changes the dynamic of the game. UX can also be used to create certain types of play behaviour, prime players to act in a certain way. So here we go, looking at Overwatch, another great game by Blizzard. And this, their post-battle screen, or post-game screen, describes all the social interactions you've had. Much more focused around the kind of teamwork that you're doing with your team, and primes players for that kind of behaviour. You look at something like Call of Duty, on the other hand, which is a very different game by the same publisher essentially, and the experience here is very different. It's all about you as an individual, the number of kills that you got, and your efforts. It also shows off their customisation, which is a big part of their long-term meta and monetization strategy. So user experience can also be used to support the thematic of a game as well. So this is Spec Ops: The Line, a really interesting game that didn't do as well as it should have done. At the beginning of the game, you get these very standard kind of tooltips. You know, this is how you jump, this is how you shoot. And as the game progresses, what you find is it starts to break the fourth wall. As the themes of the game come out, I won't spoil them for you, but it starts to question the narrative of video games in general. And also we can use video game UX to create an emotional response. These signature moments that everybody really loves. So Hearthstone here's a great example. The great graphics, the fantastic VFX, the lovely agency that you get as a player by moving that pack of cards in there. These all create really exciting moments. So now we've talked a little bit about what UX design is. This is going to give you a little insight about how you do it.
Cool, thank you, Adam. Hi guys. So hopefully you understand a little bit more about what the theory of UX is and a little bit of the history of the background. So I want to talk to you a little bit about myself first. My journey is slightly different from Adam's. I started at uni, also did graphic design. I actually worked as a book designer and an illustrator for a while, and then I went into games, working on a Brazilian company that actually makes PC games. And I ended up leaving and working as a freelance graphic designer doing branding and logo until I decided that actually my passion really lies in video games. And then I joined Space Ape in 2016, and now I do pretty much almost everything there. So I want to start by asking a few questions to you guys. Have you ever, when using an app or a game, asked yourself, where am I? How do I begin? How do I start? Where do I find this information? If you did that, and let me see a show of hands if you ever gave up on using an app or playing a game because it was too confusing. Cool. So that's what we call churning. Basically, churning means giving up. So when something becomes so difficult or so confusing that you just let go, you just rage quit, basically. That's churning. And I'm going to use that word a couple of times. That's something, a video game development term. And there's this concept that we like to use, which is called the Willpower Reservoir. It is described by Steve Krugman in the book Don't Make Me Think. It's one of the biggest resources for designers of any kind. And they have, he describes this reservoir as something that is unique to each person, and basically means each person has a different capacity to, the different amount of patience to solve a task. So people are different. Some people are more patient than others. Some people are more open than others. And that's going to mean that the size of their willpower reservoir is different. Number two, it's situational. It will depend on the type of task you're actually trying to solve. That means that, for example, you will have a much bigger reservoir for your dog or your child than you have for dealing with your landlord. Basically, simplistically saying that means that you have more patience for certain tasks than others. Third, you can top it up. If the reward for the task you're actually working on is greater than the effort it takes you to complete it, then that reservoir is actually topped up because you feel good about completing it. And also, delightful moments can help you top it up. But, finally, one mistake can empty it. If you've ever lost your total progress when filling in an online form and just accidentally pressing back and just losing everything you just did, and then you just table flip and forget it, that's churning, and that's what I mean by emptying it. So how do you deal with that? How do you actually keep it topped up? I'm going to give you some essential guidelines.
Sorry, my dear. We're just going to switch mics real quick. That one is having a bit of an issue, so.
Oh, okay. No worries.
Let me turn that one off.
Okay.
Ready?
Sorry. All right. So again, we're going to talk about some essential guidelines that I freely adapted from Jakob Nielsen's usability heuristics. Jakob Nielsen is one of the founding fathers of usability research, along with Don Norman, another big name, and I kind of adapted them to video game development. So these are the 6 heuristics or guidelines that we like to apply: clarity, familiarity, control, consistency, care, and accessibility. And today, understanding these things is actually a lot more important for a UI UX designer than being able to, just make a button look pretty. And that's the differentiator that Adam was talking about. And you need to know these rules before you learn how to break them. So we're going to begin exploring the concept of clarity. Has anyone played LA Noire? Can I see a little show of hands? Cool. For those of you who haven't played it, this is a game by Rockstar, and it was originally released for the PlayStation 3, where you play a detective investigating crimes in the LA Noire scenario. And basically, there's this really interesting interrogation mechanic where you interrogate a non-player character, an NPC, and they will react a certain way while telling you something, and you need to figure out if that's a truth, a lie, or if you have a piece of evidence that you can accuse them, you can actually do that. Originally, in this version, the options that you had were truth, doubt, and lie. But more often than not, your character didn't really respond in the way that you anticipated, because those words are too simple to describe all the range of possible reactions that he may have. And that generated a lot of frustration. So, in the remastered version for the Nintendo Switch, they actually changed the wording to good cop, bad cop, and accuse, which has an internal meaning, but doesn't really connect to the reaction. It actually makes a lot more sense, because it's not just truth and lie and doubt. This is about giving information for the player before they actually make a decision. So for clarity, you always ask yourself if you're providing enough information for the player that they can actually make a decision that's well informed. To do that, you need to predict their behavior and actually try to understand what their motivation is in that certain point of the game. And you want to prevent any kind of ambiguity, which is exactly what they did when changing the wording. Next, we are going to talk about familiarity. This is Pro Evolution Soccer. This is a 2016 edition, and this is a football game, right? And it's developed by a Japanese company. So those arrows right there are trying to indicate to the player the condition of certain of their players at that time, And for Western audiences, it might be a little bit odd that the arrow that's pointing up is red, because in the West, red means stop, wrong, don't do it, or bad. But actually, in this scenario, it's the best possible condition that player can have. And the green, which usually for us means good, go, proceed, it's actually the neutral state. This is a really good example of familiarity being cultural. Humans are wired to see patterns, but they are wired in a way that they learn that by growing up. And this is about learning a new language. And by language, I mean not just a spoken language, but also a visual language or a cultural language. And the reason why we worry about this and we need to be aware of it is because recalling things you just learned is actually way harder and takes a lot more out of your reservoir than just remembering things you already know. You recognize stuff like, for example, learning a new actual language is way harder because you never really learned your native language. You just kind of grew up with it. Next, we are going to talk about control, which means agency. This is an example actually from one of our own games. It's Fastlane, and essentially the way that you play the game is by using your thumb to steer, and you need to keep your finger on the screen to be able to do that. And the initial instruction is hold to start. But if you lift your thumb off the screen, you actually get, instead of just pausing the game or punishing you for doing that, we enter a slow motion mode that tells you hold to play so that you remember that instruction and gives you enough time to either reposition your thumb or read your objectives and see if you're actually completing them, or even looking up from your screen into this tube station and see if you're at the right stop and you need to leave, giving the player full agency over what they're doing. And control is important because feeling in control is actually better than being in control. You need to feel in control instead of just being. And for the players to feel in control, they need to feel like they can predict the reactions to their actions. So kind of like how in the LA Noire example, they actually changed the wording because it was kind of hard to predict what your character is going to do. That's what this means. They need to also see a clear path towards their goal, and so that every time they decide to do something, they feel like they know what they're doing. And this is especially crucial when we are talking about real life actions like payments, be it in an in-app purchase in a game, or even like when paying your cab drive in Uber. So the next guideline is consistency. And I'm sure everyone's seen this or a variation of this in their lives. It's just a simple control scheme screen. And this, I wanted to show this because I wanted to talk about how important it is to know the conventions before you break them and try not to reinvent the wheel. So we all know that, X or A to jump is a thing, and we try not to steer too away from that because people already know that. It's already familiar to them. So you want to keep consistency with these patterns, these known conventions. Some of them are external, like the control that I just mentioned. Some of them are internal, and you are going to determine that as a designer. For example, what your iconography means, what your icons mean, and what they are called, and color coding as well. Now our next topic is care, and by care I mean actually caring about the player. And this is my favorite example of a kind of like a strange choice in positioning. This is a game that I used to love in Nintendo DS. It's called Mario vs. Donkey Kong Minis March Again. And as you can see, that little button there says Erase Data, and it's positioned right below the main menu button, so that the main game button, and actually it's color-coded in the same color. So it's quite confusing, and it's a very destructive action that's placed right in the main menu. Thankfully, there is a confirmation dialogue that comes after this, and that's part of this section of what care means. But you should probably hide that kind of destructive actions so that people don't do that accidentally. But caring, one part of it is preventing mistakes and making sure that players don't feel dumb because they did something wrong. And again, you need to predict all kinds of behaviors, positive and negative, and hide these destructive actions to avoid that situation. And give them a second chance if they screw up. Give them a second chance by presenting confirmation dialogues and making sure that they understand what they're doing.
But caring also means providing help. And by that I mean there's a lot of stuff that you can do to actually help the player. You can start by just having a really well-designed tutorial. Never underestimate the potential and the power of a really well-designed tutorial. Even for the most experienced players, some hand-holding is actually quite soothing and quite reassuring when beginning to explore a new game. And you should also provide ample opportunity for players to access and find any kind of information they might need. And that could come in form of loading tips, like Adam's example before, of game hints, of tooltips. Basically, anything that you interact with should have an explanation of what that thing does and what it is. Control scheme screen, like I showed before, and literally a help menu, so that no one feels lost, because every time they wonder, what should I do? What does this mean? That will deplete the willpower reservoir. Finally, our last guideline is accessibility. And this is an example of something that I'm actually working on right now, because this is more about the process than about the final result. So the top row, well, on the left you see my progression of design, and the two on the right are actually simulations of the two most common kinds of color blindness. And color blindness affects 10% of all males. So it's a pretty considerable population. And on the top row you see the first iteration, the middle row you see the second, and the third you see the final and the ideal iteration. Basically, by simulating color blindness, which is part of my daily process when I'm designing a new feature, I could actually figure out that it's pretty hard to read that stat comparison between something that's positive and something that is negative when I don't have any other indicator other than the color. So I ended up adding more indicators first, a little pattern on the negative, and finally some arrows. And basically, this is because I really like these design principles, by the way, which are Microsoft's inclusive design principles, because they're really simple, and I try to apply them to my process. The first one is recognize exclusion, which means just understanding your own biases and limitations. And you know, as a designer, you won't be able to think of everyone. That's why you should learn from diversity and test with as many people as possible from different backgrounds and with different capabilities. Because if you solve for one, you actually can solve for many. For example, if you cater to someone that has only one arm, you can actually help people that recently broke one of their arms, or even new parents that are holding their child and can play with just the one arm. So it can actually be applied universally and benefit people universally. So if you remember just a couple of things, one of them should be these principles, and at any point in your design process, you should ask yourself if you're ticking all of these boxes, and the idea of the willpower reservoir, because that's really important and you should apply it everywhere. Now, you know essential theory. I want to give you some ideas on how to put this in practice. If I can open my water first. Sorry. Cool. So, our process. You want to start by crafting these experiences on paper. The flow and the hierarchy can be defined really early on paper. You're gonna abuse many notebooks and pens. This is actually a picture from my notebook. I have so many I can count. And the idea is that on paper you can sketch and fail really early. Hierarchy is really important, which is like the organization between the screens and the information. And then you can test this on a low fidelity prototype. That's the next step. You want to test early with wireframes because you want to learn how players react as early as possible. You want to gauge what's the level of effort to complete a specific task. You want to see what's their motivation in doing their stuff, what they're thinking, and what are the questions they're asking themselves, so that you can remove them, which is a really important thing. Finally, the final wrapper is the visual design. That's the thing that holds everything together. And this will help you leverage your brand and your UX and create a really nice look and feel. Now, I want to share some tips and tricks that we picked up in the game development trenches about these 5 aspects of visual design: layout, treatment, color, typography, and motion. This is the fun bit, hopefully. So layout should be defined early at wireframing stage. And I really like Overwatch as an example because they have a really clever use of space and visual rhythm to create a visual hierarchy, and it's really well defined. It basically guides the player's attention and tells you what's the most important thing they should be looking at. So, some ideas, some tips. You need to understand that different screen areas have different values because we have a reading direction, which is also cultural, but you need to be aware of that, which usually goes top to bottom, left to right in a Z formation. So you need to understand that some areas are more important than others. Have a defined grid. And by that, I mean, you need to understand what device you're designing for. Is it a mobile phone? Is it a huge screen like a TV? Is it a PC or a laptop? Is it a tablet? And create some strong constraints, some rules. You should love having constraints instead of being completely open. Create those constraints before you start designing. And give the UI room to breathe. That's the white space that I was talking about that Overwatch has. That doesn't need to be necessarily white, but yeah, any room to breathe is important to create a visual rhythm and have a consistent information hierarchy. Now, treatment is the look and the feel of the UI. This is the part that is actually making the buttons look pretty, but you actually can do a lot of stuff to create meaning with this. So some examples are how Star Wars Battlefront actually leveraged the retro-futuristic look of Star Wars by having a really minimalistic and flat UI that actually evokes that original retro idea of what the future would look like. So it can be sci-fi without having a lot of glows and holograms and scan lines. While, for example, Arkham Knight actually does all of that because it wants to have that high-tech gadgetry feeling that, you know, a Batman game should have and look really premium and expensive like Bruce Wayne. And I think they do a really good job with that. Finally, something like Hotline Miami is trying to be really nostalgic about the 80s and has some really cool references for color and for typography. So when beginning to think about treatment, ask yourself these questions. What is your game world like? That's going to determine the fiction and your inspiration on the real world of what you want to accomplish with your visual treatment. What is your aesthetic reference? These are the thousands of mood boards you're going to create and print and put it up on your wall so that you can look at them and feel inspired by them. What emotions do you want to elicit? This is your goal with how you want your UI to look like. What do you want the players to feel? Do you want them to feel chill? Do you want them to feel scared? Do you want them to feel like they know a lot of stuff and they're super smart? Think about that. And finally, what's your brand? That's going to be the umbrella that it's basically going to hold everything together. You need to have that really clear, have the answer to these questions really clear, print them up, put them on your wall, and always refer back to them when making decisions. So within the treatment stuff, we can talk about color. This is an example that I really like. Fallout is otherwise a really great game, but the usability on this specific screen always made me wonder why they decided to do it like that. And there's actually tons of online mods, tons of mods you can download online to actually improve the readability on this screen specifically. So they were trying to really push for a stylistic choice because that's their inspiration, right? And it's actually really well implemented, and stylistically it makes a lot of sense and looks really nice. But the usability isn't that great, and lots of mods out there actually prove that. So you should definitely try to leverage your aesthetic when thinking about color, but don't do it if it impairs your usability and your readability. So have that limit. Use it to enhance your experience and try not to hinder it. Understand the semantics of color. Again, that's a cultural thing, but color does have meaning, and you wouldn't want people to be confused and wondering what that button does just because the color might be telling them it does something when it doesn't. Again, we're talking about the Willpower Reservoir. And finally, remember the accessibility guidelines, not just color blindness, but also, for example, particularly we developing games for mobile need to be aware that people will be using their mobile phones on different scenarios. In the light, in the middle of the day, on the park, in their room with the night shift mode turn on. So they need to be able to read the game and understand it, even though they have so many different scenarios they might be using it in. Now, for typography, which is something that I really like, this is one of my favorite mobile games, Alto's Adventure, and I really love the pairing of typography that they have between the logo and this really nice slab serif that reads as something really friendly, really nice. It really sets the tone for their inspiration, their aesthetic inspiration of like Central America, but also it looks like a really friendly game, looks really approachable. This pairing specifically tells me this game is chill, you're gonna relax, it's friendly, it's not gonna hurt you in any way. So be aware of that kind of stuff. Try to remember the emotions you're trying to elicit, because fonts have visual character and you need to be able to pair them really well, because you want to have really good readability while also kind of hinting at the art style and the aesthetic you're trying to go for. Also keep localization in mind. Localization is really important because some fonts don't really have the characters you need to render to display all of the possible languages that your game might be in. Some fonts don't have Cyrillic or Turkish or Korean, and you might have to substitute, so be mindful of that. And also have strong constraints. For example, you don't want to use any goofy fonts unless that makes a lot of sense and you have a really good excuse for it, or system fonts. And also you don't want to mix too many weights and styles and sizes in the same screen. Basically, all of this means that it's worth paying for quality. Fonts you can have many amazing free fonts online, but if you find a font that actually ticks all of your boxes, pay for it and buy the right license so that you can actually distribute it with your app. Finally, I want to talk a bit about my current passion, which is motion. So, motion is interesting for me and I really like it, because it's so multi-purpose. I want to show you a few examples here. One of them is this Supercell game, Clash Royale. I'm sure most of you have played it. And motion can actually help create a lot more meaning in an action that could otherwise be too simple, not meaningless, but like too simple. This is basically the upgrading sequence for a card, and you can actually create a lot of meaning and a lot of visual relation between the act of the bar coming down, coming into the card, the explosion telling you that the card has leveled up, the change of the text, and the animation of the stats going up. This is also a really good celebratory moment for the player, so you want to make them feel nice and top that reservoir up. Now, another example is in Burrito Bison, where you can actually use motion to create relations and connections between a player's action and what's going on the screen. For example, the flipping motion right here is actually creating a connection between the player's tap and telling them that they have changed the selection on the right. Another thing that's interesting about this specific example is that little star right there. That star is creating a connection between the act of purchasing an upgrade and updating the value of your piñata right there, which is a little gacha something we call gacha, where you open it and you get some rewards out of it. That's actually upgrading the level of your piñata. So it creates a connection. So again, it's my favorite topic because it can be used to do so many things at once. It can guide the players. You can guide the player's attention with it, literally sometimes pointing at where is important and just removing all of that question of, okay, where should I look now? You can use this to point them to it. You can establish the information hierarchy, where I am, where I'm going to, how do I come back, by simply animating the screens in and out so that you know where you're going to and from. And it's a great outlet for art style because there's so many different ways you can represent animation. It can be really bold, it can be bouncy, it can be fantastical, you can use a lot of special effects. And again, creating moments of delight. Any wow moment and delightful moment actually holds your player closer to the experience and tops the reservoir up. So finally, be mindful of your art style. Remember the usability guidelines, remember accessibility, and you can create an incredible variety of different things when just combining all of those things together. And if you feel like this is something that you want to do, then go for it. So now I'm gonna just give the mic back to Adam, and he's gonna talk a little bit more about the daily life of a UI designer.
Cool. So yeah, we're into our last section now. So we've heard a lot about being a designer, a lot about being an artist, but the really great UI designers, in my opinion, are the guys that really know a little bit more about production. So So they're the kind of guys that really know the market. They understand the goals of the company. They understand the goals of the game. And the way that you can do this is through these three sort of soft skills. So learning to empathise, communicating effectively, and getting really good at accepting feedback. So what do I mean by empathy and learning to empathise? You need to understand what your players want. You need to understand what they don't want, and you need to advocate this on their behalf to your team. Being an advocate for the player is pretty much all a UX designer is. So what do players want? Players love characters and stories, like we've said many a time. So you take a look at one of our games like Transformers, we know the people playing those games love Autobots and they love Decepticons. So at every opportunity we try and leverage that and get them in front of players. Players want to be rewarded. They really love those moments of light, those animations, all the stuff that Lissa's been telling you about. Show, don't tell. So everyone hates overlong tutorials that kind of push you along on a certain path. But you need to gently pull players along. But players learn much more effectively if you're showing them rather than telling them. And those little details matter. Again, those little wows, Easter eggs, little moments of joy, throwbacks to other games. Hearthstone does this really well with its little animations and stuff. Stuff like that players love. Things that players don't want. No one wants to come to a game and feel stupid. And in fact, no player should ever feel stupid in one of your games, because if they do, then you're doing your job wrong. It's not if a player's having a problem, it's not because they're not bright enough, it's because you as a UI designer haven't done your job well enough. Do things that feel like work. Filling in forms, filling in forms or busy work, editing settings. Like opening a reward or loot box should feel great, but changing the sound effects or turning the sound off should be a really simple task. Don't make your players think too hard. Again, they're here to play, they're not necessarily here to be challenged in a sort of mental way. And players don't tend to like to read too much. So avoid text as much as you can. Show players, again, gently lead them by the hand. My personal little thing about this is if you can't tweet it, then you probably shouldn't be writing it. And communicate effectively. So making a game on your own is really tough, so you really do need a team around you. Lots of people do it on their own, but I'd highly recommend working with others. And as a new experience designer, you need to be clear on your vision of what you think the experience should be, advocate to your team. And then listen to them when they give you feedback, listen to what your teammates say. And again, take feedback. This is a really big point. As a UI designer, I spend most of my time being wrong. And I spend a lot of my time in this little build, test, learn loop. This all comes from lean methodologies. So what we tend to do is we build a version of something, we test it against real players or even internally, and they tell us it's rubbish. And then we do it again, and we've learnt something new, and we build something new, and we take it back to them, and they still tell us it's rubbish. But it's slightly better than it was last time. And so we keep going round and round and round in this circle. And yes, sometimes it's repetitive, but it's the only way to make really great products. And eventually you get something that's kind of shippable, and you ship it. And if you're in games as a service like we are, then you keep in this cycle and keep in this cycle, constantly refining your game. So yes, seek out feedback from players. I always use my mum. I love my mum, but she's not great at video games. So if I can show her one of my games and she gets it, I know I'm on the right track. You should have strong opinions. Like I say, you have to be a vision holder to some degree, but be prepared to have that vision challenged and be prepared to change your mind. Art and opinion are subjective, but stats are not. So I'll give you a great example. On Samurai Siege, we built this amazing tutorial the entire team loved, where you'd attack a giant castle and then you'd get beaten back, and it was a reversal of fortune, and it was really great. The entire team loved it. We put it out to the public and tested it against a way more conventional tutorial that we'd done. And the way more conventional tutorial was much more successful in keeping players in our leap and keeping them playing. So we just had to bin it. That's just the way it works. Honest and candid feedback is the best kind of feedback you're going to get. It's not the easiest stuff to take, but the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. So yeah, if, having heard me say all that, you still want to be a UX designer, I've got a few tips for you. Do it because you love it. I don't want to be negative, but I see so many people who think being a UI designer is just a way into the industry. You know, they're going to be a concept artist or an illustrator. Be a UI designer because you love designing UI and you love giving players a great experience. So practice, I've borrowed some of these slides from Adam last week. Theory is good, but practice is even better. Play lots of games. Play everything from mobile, PC, the smallest indie games, the biggest mainstream games. Play as much as you can. study and understand what makes those experiences great, and understand them in the context of the market as well. Have a learning mentality. Seek out knowledge wherever you can. There's loads of great resources out there. YouTube, some great video essays, Mark Brown series, the No Clip series, or even stuff that you wouldn't even think about. Psychology, and economics, cinematography, all of this stuff is really, really useful. And spend time with your software as well. There seems to be a new UI tool out every week. I can't even keep up. But they are generally really very cheap, very easy to use. And once you've mastered a couple, all skills are pretty transferable. So yeah, time, effort and passion are kind of what you need to get into the games industry. But the one thing you really will need if you want to be a UI designer is a great portfolio. Now, I see so many portfolios which are really bloated with loads and loads of work, but really concentrate on just showing a few really, really great things. You know, don't include that weird family portrait that you did in high school. You'll see it's really great to see how you're working through these solutions. So maybe your final solution for a problem isn't the best, but me as an interviewer or someone looking at a CV, if I've seen your process and seen how you've got to where you've got to, I can take a step back and say, well, you know, if they made this decision or someone had mentored them or guided them in a certain way, they would have got a really great result. The best thing to do is just to build stuff, though. Get together with your friends, build a game. So there's a saying of like 10,000, is it 100,000 hours to be like really great at something. Start now. The quicker you get that experience, the quicker you'll get better. A degree is really helpful. You know, university courses are great, but ultimately I feel like it's the soft skills that you learn, like teamwork and empathy and that kind of stuff, are really going to make you guys the developers of the future. So we've got a couple of recommended resources. We've got a bunch more at the back of the slide deck, which we'll share a little bit later. I think we've mentioned all of these throughout our talk, but Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug. I can't recommend this book enough. Get on Amazon and buy it now. Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman, who's the godfather of usability testing, and a relatively new book, The Gamer's Brain by Celia Hoden. It's a really insightful book about how players' brains work when they're playing games. And of course, you can always check out our blog, which has new articles monthly. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Awesome. We're now going to have a Q&A. So we have some questions from the audience on Twitch. And of course, you guys, if you want to pop up your hand, I'll come around and ask or get your questions. So we'll start off with one from Twitch. That'll give me time to move around the room. If you want to shoot up your hands now, then I'll know where to go first. First question comes from Lunchbox OW. I'm currently a web developer. How hard would it be to transition into UX design for gaming?
That was exactly my path. So I was a web developer in advertising before I joined games. I think the skills that you learn as a designer or as a web developer are pretty transferable. It's mostly the format, but these days if you're a web developer, you're developing for 100 different types of screen anyway. So I think, yeah, really transferable.
Hey, I'm Luke. What kind of bad UI or UX patterns are you fed up of seeing in current games?
That's a tough one. Make sure I don't offend anybody. You got one? Oh, she's braver than I am.
No, this is more of a concurrent thing that actually was one of my biggest pet peeves, which is like bad onboarding. And I think my number one thing is not priming for native notifications. This is very prevalent on mobile. I don't think if there's anything that like that in PC or console. But basically, you know, when you start a game, I don't know if you've had that experience before, and the first thing that you see is like, do you want to allow notifications for this game? I think that's kind of like a really easy way out, and you can actually prime for that using a game dialogue before doing that. So it's like, hey, do you want us to tell you when your new loot box is ready, before actually asking them to tap on the native thing. And I think there's a lot of dark patterns around. Actually, if you Google that, dark patterns, there's a lot of stuff around just kind of like online forums that's kind of like general, but there's some stuff related to games as well. There was a really good GDC talk last year, I think, or the year before that. So I just Googled that and check that out.
Cool. Badabata is asking, when facing something in the development that goes against the common UX, but it's truly core of the gameplay, how does this process work? How do you balance those things?
I think you have to give it a try. Like, I think if you're changing the core experience, it's a very difficult thing to do. And I think as long as players are understanding it and getting on board with it, then you can move the rest of the game around that kind of experience. Yeah.
And test. Always test. Test early and fail early.
I've got a question which may not actually have an answer. With console development and PC development, for accessibility, being able to customize controls is something which, so being able to kind of remap everything. I'm just wondering if there's anything that people wouldn't think about for mobile development where you may need to give more than just, so you went through the color blindness options, but is there any other kind of ways that we can make games more accessible for mobile platforms for people who may have any kind of physical impairments or kind of sight impairments, hearing impairments, and so on?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you kind of consider the accessibility guidelines early, you can actually catch a lot of that stuff, particularly if you test with people that actually have those sort of like visual impairments. I think it's kind of difficult because mobile has like kind of one way of interacting with it, which is by tapping on stuff. With console and PC, there's like tons of different ways you can actually interact with a game. That includes voice, that includes different types of control. And it might be a little bit more challenging due to the limitations of the interaction you have with mobile. But specifically for visual stuff, you can take a look at contrast ratios, making sure that there's high contrast. And again, you don't have to necessarily have that as an option. It could be optimized for everyone, which is kind of what I'm trying to do with color blindness, for example. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. It is a bit more challenging than for console and PC, for sure. Do you have any...
Yeah, this was a big subject recently at a conference I attended, and I don't think anyone really has the answers at the moment for mobile. I think we have pretty robust answers for PC and console. Mobile is just proving a little more difficult. I'm sure we're going to get there because these devices are transformative, right? So whether it's just for games or for any other kind of application, I think we'll get there, but we're just not there yet.
Lexi Play from Twitch is asking, I'm a drawing-focused artist with creative problem-solving skills, but without much technological experience. What kind of tech experience should I get familiar with before trying to break into the gaming development field?
I actually think although tech skills are really useful and a lot of developers do look for them, they're actually fairly easy to teach once you're in a job. So, if you've used Unity or Unreal or any of those big engines, that's a bonus, but it's not a prerequisite. Like I've certainly hired people who haven't even touched the engine that we use in shop, which is Unity, because we know that we can get those guys up to speed. If you're smart and talented, then I wouldn't worry too much about it.
Yeah. Kiki UK is asking if there are any classes that sort of focus on the stuff in more in depth that people could check out. Wherever.
I mean, if generally the skills that you're going to learn for like web design and usability are actually pretty useful, and there's tons of materials online, tons of classes online that you can actually find, some free stuff. So if you look for it in like Udemy, you're going to find a lot of good stuff. But generally, if you study graphic design, you're going to have a primer on all of the stuff that we discussed here. And again, just read the books. It's like Adam said, the text skills are actually pretty learnable once you're in there. But the soft skills and the more theoretical stuff, it's pretty interesting to learn before.
Yeah, I think Medium has a really good community of UI UX guys, not necessarily directly related to games, but definitely related to UX. Yeah, I think there's a lot of courses. I'd definitely go with a graphic design course or something along those lines. There's definitely HCI courses, which were a thing when I was a student, and they seem to be really successful as well. So,
what's something each of you wish that you had known before you got in the industry? If you had somebody to tell you, if you could have, time traveled and had somebody tell you back then.
Probably that I should get used to being wrong, because I'm wrong all the time, and yeah, it's just one of those things. Like you turn up to the industry thinking you're really smart and you know everything, and I'm constantly having my ass kicked, and as well, like always hire people that are better than you, which is a great one. Like The people that I like to hire and I like to bring into the company with us are people that make me nervous about my own job.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one, and I think maybe I would say testing early is really important. So like be really acquainted with the idea of testing on paper, with wireframes, and as early as possible with actual real players. So that's a pretty big one, and also that stats are gonna kick your ass sometimes. And like Adam says, sometimes you're gonna have to bin some of your better work, the things that you're most excited about, just because really the stats are telling you actually that's not as great as you think, and you need to be able to accept that you're wrong every now and then.
This is coming from Illurik, and he's asking, or she, I'm a junior graphic designer trying to break into UX. I practice with Adobe XD, but I don't have the experience to apply for jobs at the moment. What can I do to start or even convince someone to hire me as a UX designer?
I'd keep building stuff, get better, practice. It's persistence. Like I can't tell you how many times I applied to work at Sony before they gave me a job. It must have been at least like 20. And then even then, when I joined EA, I'd applied there about 15 times as well. So and they always turned me down. So I can be persistent, keep practicing, build stuff that's realistic. I think like no, I don't need to see any more weather apps or clock apps or redesigns of Facebook without any adverts. Like, because that's not how the business works, right? Be aware of those constraints when you're designing.
Yeah, for sure. And also show passion. So if you do apply and do try to apply, do try for those jobs that you want to, when you're there, just show the passion that you have for problem solving, and just like guide us through your process. That's actually the most interesting part of the UI development, and actually it's just solving the problems and guiding us through the process. So the more passionate you show that you are about that, even if you don't have the experience yet, even if you don't have a lot of stuff to show, that's going to be really important.
And speaking of interviews, do you guys have any tips for how people should conduct themselves in an interview once they actually make it through the door?
Passion is the number one thing, I think, in my opinion. And just humble. Be humble about your stuff, and talk about your mistakes as well. If you can tell us that you found a mistake like you committed a mistake in your process, and you can explain to us why that happened and how you solved it, that's even better than just showing like an amazing result out of the blue.
I agree.
He agrees.
Yeah.
ProKit F is asking, do you like the way modern games are going with their UI design? If you could change one thing about modern games UI, what would it be?
I think modern games UI is better than it's ever been. I think we're making things more accessible, more open to a bigger audience. I think that's a great thing, especially with stuff like accessibility. I don't think there's anything I'd really change. I think we're seeing a lot of unique takes. Like, when Destiny came along 4 years ago and had a mouse pointer on console, everyone was like, "Whoa, what's all this about?" And now it's an accepted part of the industry. I think we're heading in a really good place. I think the future is really exciting. I think AR has got a lot of potential to change things up. I'm really excited about voice control. Like, I have an Alexa in my house, and that's amazing. I think there's a generation of kids growing up now that are just going to be used to talking to their house to get to do things, and I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to do that with a video game.
Yeah, that's very true.
What you just touched on there, Adam, in the last bit, and you said you're really excited about this happening in the future. You think it's going to head in this direction. What about you, Lissa?
Yeah, I definitely would say AR and voice control. Like, I hate repeating what Adam just said, but definitely this generation of people growing up using voice control to control all aspects of their lives will be it's going to be pretty interesting what types of different interaction you can actually come up with. And for UI designers, that's really exciting, because what's going to be different. It's going to be a different world. I'm not that sure about VR because it's kind of like inaccessible at the moment. It's quite expensive, and you need like a special type of headset. AR seems a bit more achievable and at a consumer level. So I think we're going to have a lot more experimentation with it and new types of interaction.
Cool. And out of your reading list there, Adam, can you pick out one thing or one book that's really good for UI UX design? Tommy Yak 102 was asking, what are the best books documentation to read if you want to learn more about UI UX design? Is there a particular one?
Yeah, I think Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug it's super easy to read. You can read it in like a couple of hours. It's like pretty much everyone at Space Ape's read it, I would have thought. Like certainly a lot of the PMs and the design, sort of regular game designers have read it. There's also another one which is, it's not rocket scientists, but the same guy. It's about usability testing, and that kind of closes the circle on how you test as well as design. So that's a good pairing there.
And I would point out Creativity Inc., which is kind of a staple at Space Ape. It's about Pixar, and it's just an amazing book around creativity and just exploring creative thinking.
Awesome. Thanks. Any last minute things that you guys want to add?
No, I think that's it. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Can we give them a big big round of applause? Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. For you guys watching at home, like I said, this was our second to last masterclass, which means tomorrow is going to be our very last masterclass. It's going to be about communities. I'm sure you're all part of a gaming community, or would like to be, or maybe like to work in community management. So join us tomorrow at 5 p.m. We'll be doing that lecture at UCL. And by we, I mean myself. I'll be doing that lecture. So come along for that. And then after that final lecture, we're also going to have a social where some of you students can mingle and also talk to some of our speakers who have been giving the lectures so far. That's going to be at UCL as well. You can check out our social media for all the details on where it will be and how to get there, etc. It'll be at 6:30 tomorrow evening. If you have missed some of our past lectures, then make sure to check them out on Twitch. They're all going to be housed there. You can check out all our past videos. And as I mentioned before, we're going to put up the slides on our blog as well, and we'll re-air some of the sessions with a live Q&A so you can ask more questions. We know that's one of the most interesting parts about these lectures, is where you guys actually get to ask us questions. So yeah, we will see you tomorrow for our final lecture. We hope that you can make it, and thanks everybody for watching today. Bye, guys.